conservation things about the war. So there was about 4 or 5 of them, I think, that he did that I remember most. I had a look at that myself, but it's kind of something quite different.
Hello, everybody. Pardon me. If my voice suddenly gives out, I probably should hold up cards or something. So, part of I'm a bit croaky. I do apologize. Thank you all for coming. Thank Claire for coming to speak to us this evening and making this the point of us all being here. And she's come to talk about her new book, this one here, the third in the Josephine Fox series, which we'll get to shortly. But I would like to start just to chat with Claire a bit about herself.
The most exciting subject.
It's how you tell the story.
Yeah, okay, we'll try and do it.
As I'm sure. So it's, as we may possibly most of us know, Claire is local.
Yes.
From a Romseyite. Is that the proper terminology?
Romsonian, I think.
Romsonian.
I don't know, really.
I like Romseyite better.
Okay.
Okay.
Fine. I don't mind being a knight.
And her books are also set locally, and again, which we'll get to and talk about in a bit. But I did want to talk to Claire about becoming a writer, which is something that she didn't start, as most writers didn't start out from childhood doing, though some do.
I did.
So you came to it a bit later in life.
Yeah, I had actually always what my mother would have called, well, been a storyteller, and she wasn't always being polite when she said it. I'm an only child, and we lived on a little farm, and it was quite isolating back in the 50s when I was a little girl, and I didn't really have anybody much to play with, so I used to tell stories to my toys. I read a lot. I've always been a great reader, and I told stories to my toys, and I made stories for my toys. And some point in my fairly youth, I read the book about the Brontes and them writing little stories for their imaginary people, and I plagiarized that idea, and I used to do those sorts of things. But yeah, my sort of serious writing career didn't start then. I've always written a bit, but it was after I suppose my serious trying to get published writing would have been when my children were young, and I would be doing it as, some people in here are going to scream if I say this word, but kind of hobby. It wasn't really a hobby.
Oh, I thought for a moment you were saying you were locking them in the coal cellar.
No. But a hobby is, kind of not what we do. We just let out the creative bit and write, isn't it? So it never felt like a hobby. It felt like a need or a something important to be doing to keep me from locking them in the coal cellar. Yeah.
It's not unusual, and I'm sure many people still do that, whether they've gone on to pursue it any further than that writing is a way to keeping a journal or keeping a diary or writing down the little bits of things that occur to you, or is a way of making sense of their lives, keeping a certain sense of order in their lives, a certain way of being able to deal with things as well too. Small children and such, who are no longer small.
No, they've got children of their own now. So
there's so at some point though you moved from that sort of writing to something a bit more involved.
I did. So my first career was as a nurse. I was at Winchester Hospital. I trained at Winchester Hospital and worked there for a while. Then when I had my children, it was back in Maggie Thatcher's day, and it wasn't easy to keep your job at that point. So I stopped doing that. I did all sorts of things. One of my very favourite jobs was I worked in the local school as a librarian, as a volunteer. I didn't get paid, but it was great fun. I loved that job. And then when the boys went off to university, I went back to nursing to earn some money. And then eventually my job became redundant, my nursing job. I was doing research nursing and my job became redundant. And I said to Nick, sitting over the back there, everybody in the family's got a degree except me. It's my turn now. And he said, yeah, all right. And I said, I'm going to university. And he said, what are you going to do? And I wrote to Winchester University and said, would you take me to do creative writing? And they said, oh, all right then. So I went to do 2006. I went off to do the creative writing undergraduate degree, which I loved. I loved being at university. Never had so much fun in all my life. And then when I got to the end of my BA degree, I said to my the chap who'd been my supervisor, well, I think I'll do an MA now. And he said, no, you don't want to do that. You can do that. He said, just go and do a PhD. You can write your novel. It's easy. It's easy, he said. And it wasn't. It was the hardest 7 years of my life. I did it as a part-time degree, and it was very, very difficult. The first book, Return, The Unexpected Return, this is mostly my PhD submission. I had to write a commentary about making that relevant to other people's writing, so I tried to compare it and contrast it with Golden Age crime fiction, and it was the basis of my thesis. And then after I got the PhD, finally, after, I won't go into all the horrors of getting the PhD, actually managing to deal with it, to get it, I had a book that I didn't know what to do with, and I thought I'd better do something with it, and I sent it off. I saw the advertisement online for the Richard and Judy search for a bestseller, and 2018 it was in, but it actually didn't come out until 2019, and I sent it off. It was sent 10,000 words and a synopsis and a little biography of yourself, and it didn't cost anything to enter, which was a really good thing, because most writing competitions cost you a lot of money to enter, so it didn't cost me anything. So I sent it off, this 10,000 words, and lo and behold, to my humongous surprise, I can't tell you how surprised I was, because I'd sent off other stories, other other novels that I'd written in the past, and got them back with, yes dear, you can write, but we're not interested in this. So I wasn't expecting to get anywhere in the competition. Had a real surprise, got a email one morning to say that I had been shortlisted, and there were 5 of us that had been shortlisted. And I knew of one of the people, I didn't know them personally, but I knew of one of the people that had also been shortlisted, and I thought she would be a shoo-in for the prize, because she'd won lots of other prizes with other things, not with novels, because you had not to have had a novel published, but she'd had lots of short stories and things published. So the worst bit of that was I was told not to tell anybody that I had been shortlisted, and it was, you can tell I talk about everything all the time. It was burning a hole in my mind not to speak, and I finally told my husband, and he kind of like, yeah, okay. And I said, I'm not gonna win, and he said, no, all right. I can't tell anyone.
I think telling your husband.
I wasn't allowed to tell him.
And
then we also got a thing back from the publishers, Bonnier, from one of the editors, telling us what they thought we ought to do with the story to make it a winner, or to be commercially more viable. And there were several clever things I'd done with my thesis that I really loved, and they told me to get rid of them, and said, no, get rid of all that, we don't like all that, put in something else instead. So I spent about 3 months, we had till, I think that was, I can't remember, November time, and it was January it had to go back in again, and I spent the time trying to put in the things that I thought they wanted. I didn't tell them, well, I had already told them I'd written the whole book, but anyway, I did it and sent it off. And again, was absolutely dumbfounded when I learned I'd won the prize. And again, they told me not to tell anybody. And he was out, sorry, Nick, but he was off out Actually, sadly, I think it was at a funeral, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
it's Andy's funeral.
Yeah, and I couldn't ring him up because I knew he was at a funeral. You can't ring somebody at a funeral, and I was desperate. And my brother-in-law and sister-in-law dropped in, which they did this afternoon. Actually, it must be something going on, mustn't it? And I was desperate to tell him, and I'd left a message for Nick, and he rang up, and he said, "What's this all about? What's important?" And I couldn't tell him because they were here. So I was like, just get home, just hurry home, I've got things to tell you. Anyway, that's all past history. I thought then I was made, you know, it was going to be really, really easy. But even after that, there were quite a lot of changes they wanted done to the novel, and lots of editing that happened to the novel. And eventually it came out as The Unexpected Return of Josephine Fox, which is not what it had been called when it first started off. It was called Close to Home, but somebody had inconveniently pinched the title about 3 months beforehand, and made a real great success of a book called Close to Home, so I had to change it. But I didn't choose it, the publishers chose the title. In fact, none of the titles are my title. They've all been chosen by the publishers, so...
It's always
Don't blame me.
No, there's always, pardon me, always a little bit of an interesting insight into how much control you have over your babies. As
That's
it were.
right. I really, when they first came up with The Unexpected Return of Josephine Fox, I was really thought, this is such a long title, it's going to be really difficult to get across to anybody. But there were a lot of titles like this at that time, weren't there, in 2019? There were a lot of the something of somebody else, and I think they were on that bandwagon. And they've got shorter and shorter. So, you know, it was this one, The Unexpected Return of Josephine Fox, and then it was Treachery at Hursley Park House, and now 4 words only, A Conflict of Interest. So it's getting shorter and shorter.
So at some point it'll just be crime.
Well, the one I'm working on at the moment's got a 2-word title, and it's my title, and I'm hoping they'll keep it. Perhaps, maybe.
Well, hopefully you get to the point where you'll have a bit more influence over what actually happens. It's an interesting, pardon me, I do hope I'm going to get through this. You may just having to do all the talking yourself, I'm afraid.
You can see I can talk.
No, it's an interesting thing you said before about immediately all these things that you had quite thought highly of that you had put in there, and that you thought was very clever.
All the clever bits, they had to go.
And it kind of brings up the question about creative writing. Now, I know this is you teach it at Winchester, and you've gone through to get your doctorate and all the rest of it. But it's just in preparing for this and thinking about the whole creative writing industry there is at a university level. And it didn't really exist much before the 1970s. I think that's really kind of, University of East Anglia, I think, is probably where the forerunners, and all in the States, I expect they were ahead.
I think the States first, and then East Anglia obviously was the big one.
So
gradually got more.
Previous to that, people came to writing in other ways, and now the number of authors I've written who've written fiction, not so much nonfiction ones, but the ones who've written fiction, almost all of them have gone through a creative writing program of some sort or other.
Yeah.
So it seems to be that's the route to it now. And I was just wondering, going back to saying before about what you did as a child and then through your earlier life, and it's a bit of a sliding doors question, but would you see yourself having written novels without having gone through the creative writing? Well, it's a hard question. You can tell me we can
it's
move
difficult.
on from that if it's.
I mean, I had obviously I'd always wanted to be a novelist, to write a proper long full-length story. I had been published with the odd short story, with the odd poem, and some of them were very odd. But I hadn't, obviously never, I'd written a number of novels before this one. In fact, when I went to university, at first I thought I was just going to get novels written when I went to university. But actually what happened is for 3 years that I was doing my BA, I never touched the novel at all, a novel at all. It was on the back burner, but I learned a lot about writing. I'd say perhaps one of the things, it's difficult to say. I think one of the things that doing a creative writing degree helped me with, apart from it gave me a bigger perspective about what I might write and how I might write it, was that it makes people think you're serious about writing. I'd spent a lot of years saying, when people ask me what I did, I'd say, oh, well, I'm a school librarian, but I do, I write. What have you had published? Well, nothing. And, oh, it's a hobby then, which is why I hissed at the word hobby earlier on. And, there's that kind of feeling that it's not serious unless you've been published. And anyone who's written and tried to get published knows how difficult it is. And it's a huge hurdle. It isn't just a tiny hurdle to get past. That looking around at a number of books that are on the shelves and the competition that's out there to get published is really tricky. So I think having done a creative writing degree made people think that I was serious about what I was doing. And when I said I'm doing a creative writing degree, or I've done a creative writing degree, they stopped asking me, what have you been how it been published, and they took me seriously. And I think that was helpful. But I mean, I think as a writer, I was mature enough already, but it matured my understanding of some of the things you needed to be able to do to be a successful writer, I guess. And obviously, I've been alive a lot of years. If you didn't hear already, it's my birthday today. And I've been alive a lot of years. And I've read a lot.
I don't think it's that many years myself.
Sorry, Bob. And I've read a lot, and all of that feeds into what you do as a writer. But I think creative writing degree put the polish on me, and I think it made it easier to write something that would work for, not just for me and my friends, but would work for people that were buying books.
I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a sort of thinking. I mean, thinking about it, but is you sort of wonder how people did before.
Yeah.
Because there's a big gap between being a reader and being a writer.
There is. Yeah.
I mean, you could read voraciously, which I've done all my life. I would begin to write. I can critique other people's writing, but then to sit down and do it, there's a lot. There's a lot that you do need to learn outside of just being familiar with the
there is
former genre. I think what we'd stop and do now, I'd ask you if perhaps you would read something from Conflict of Interest, and then we can talk about the books themselves.
Okay. I've come woefully unprepared. I've had to borrow a book from Bob because I forgot to bring a copy to read from, which sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Again, actually, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law dropped in this afternoon, and I didn't get myself organised. I don't know if I was reading this at uni, I would need to give a content warning because it's a little bit gruesome. So I'm giving you a content warning that this is a little bit gruesome. Okay, it's from early on in the book, Conflict of Interest. I'll just give you a little bit of an idea about what it's about. It's set in the very end of World War II. It's set around D-Day in Romsey. You may or may not know that round here there were an awful lot of troops stationed, billeted, of all kinds, all the way around. And the book begins with there being a car which is set on fire in a country lane, and when they go to see what's happened, there's a body in the car, and my main character, Jo, is the coroner's assistant in Romsey. Her boss is a chap called Bram, who is the coroner. They are obviously, the places are real. The story is fictitious, including the fact that there never was a coroner in Romsey. So whatever. Anyway, so this is early on when Bram and Jo are going to see what's happened. They've been called to go and see what's happened. When I'd first come to work at Nash, Simmons and Bing, I'd been somewhat put out to find my desk tucked away in a dead-end back corridor, wedged in between filing cabinets and surrounded by shelves heaped with mouldering files. In the time since, I've tidied the shelves and dealt with the files, but the bulwark of the tall cabinets gives me a private place, a space of my own away from the rest of the office, where nobody comes unless they're looking for me. This morning, I'm even more thankful for my privacy than usual. I've got time to get my face in order before anyone sees how upset I am. I busy myself with mindless tasks, checking the diary for appointments, ruling up a new page in my notebook ready for the day's work. All too soon, I hear footsteps approaching. Not Aggie, not her brisk heel tap, nor Fred's soft shuffle. Bram, of course. I take a breath to fortify myself, stand up, notebook in hand. Mr. Nash, I say, as he appears in the dogleg turn of the passage. Joe. I feel my colour mount at the sound of my name on his lips. Another breach of the unspoken covenant we entered into so many months ago in the wake of Richard's return. Please don't. He frowns. I came to apologise. I fake a smile. You don't have to do that. What's the gen? No more than you already know. White's picking me up in a couple of minutes. There's no need for you to come if you'd rather not. It sounds pretty grim. It's a sort of fencing match. He offers me a way out, won't say he'd rather go alone. I pretend not to understand, advance my own challenge. He'll have to tell me outright if he doesn't want me with him. Of course I'll come. You'll want a note-taker. A sigh, not so much conceding the skirmish as impatient. If you're ready then, White will be here momentarily. I follow him to the front office, grab my coat just as the chief fire officer comes in. He greets Bram, looks askance at me. Is Mrs. Lester coming with us? It's not really. Oh, for pity's sake, it's not my first dead body, you know. Not even the first burned one. I stalk out of the door to the waiting car. If these men think I'll take one look and fall in a heap on the ground, they're very much mistaken. But it is grim when we arrive at the site on a lane that apparently sees little traffic on a Monday morning. The fire officer's car pulls up well clear of the blackened heap of metal. I get out quickly, not wanting another battle about whether I should be here or not. As I approach, I can see the front of the vehicle has been shielded from the worst of the heat by the engine block, though the whole forward part of the structure, headlights and radiator grille, bumper and number plate, have tipped skywards because of the collapsed chassis further back. The number plate is still surprisingly legible. A local registration, not a military vehicle. Behind the car, several yards of hedgerow are blackened, and the grass underfoot is sodden with water from the fire engine's pump. There's a sullen smell hanging in the damp air of metal and organic matter fused together, as if someone has boiled a gigantic saucepan dry. After the first unwary breath, I turn my head aside, but then I see White watching me with a told-you-so look on his face, and turn back. Beyond the wreck of the car, a miserable policeman stands. On the ground at his feet, a huddled shape is covered with green tarpaulin. Bram looks around. I've never seen him look so bleak. How long do you estimate the fire burned before you were able to get it under control? A quarter of an hour, maybe? We got the call from ARP at 3:05 this morning. The fire must have been going a few minutes before they spotted it, so I'd estimate it started around 3 o'clock. We arrived on scene at 15:15. It would have been quicker if we'd known the precise location, but you can see why no one else reported it. Must be half a mile or more to the nearest house, and there'd been no traffic at that time of night. The one time all the blessed soldiers who'd been about might have come in useful, and they were gone. As soon as we got here, we saw the body, but it was obvious there was nothing we could do for the fellow. Far too hot to extract him. No point in our chaps getting hurt. He must have been dead before the ARP called it in. You think it is a man? Just my manner of speaking, Mr. Nash. To be honest, I don't think anyone could be sure as things stand. We'll need the medical chappie to take a look, but I'd say by the general build, it's more likely to be a man. Driver's seat or passengers? Drivers. We've got the number plate, so we should be able to make a presumption of identity once we get the information from the registration office, unless the car's been stolen. If that's the case, White says, could be anyone. As you say, with all the movement round here in the last 48 hours, Bram takes a deep breath, nods at the policeman. Better have a look. The sooner it's done, the sooner we can move the body. The police constable grimaces, a complex twitch of his facial muscles that's hard to interpret before he bends and with a theatrical gesture sweeps the covering from the victim. The body's been laid on its side in the grass, still in the kind of position he or she had been in, sitting in the car. The blackened skin and fused-on clothes, the arms drawn up into a boxer's defensive pose, and twisted legs are no surprise. As I'd said to Bram and Officer White, this wasn't my first experience of seeing someone who died in a fire. I'd been in London in the autumn of 1940, when the Blitz was at its height, seen bodies then that had been burned in the bombing, but I'd never seen anything quite as bad as this. My stomach clenches, and for a moment I wish I'd listened to what the men had said and stayed behind. It's shocking and yet somehow impossible to look away from this ruin of a human being. The hands have gone completely, and no vestige of the victim's features remain. One foot is still attached, but the other, in its charred boot, has fallen away. If this isn't the car's owner, it's going to be a hell of a job to identify who it is. All right, Bram says to the policeman, his voice tight. That's enough. Get the body covered up again, for God's sake. I'll speak to Sergeant Tilling about moving it to the mortuary, but I don't want anything else touched until we have photographs of the site. We'll need a full record before you disturb the rest. You'll want an expert to look at the car too, White says. I can tell you now, there's no sign it was involved in a collision, nothing serious enough to start a fire anyway. I see Bram rub the left side of his face where the metal mask meets the flesh of his cheek. It's a gesture I know so well, betraying more feeling than his impassive expression suggests. What if someone was careless, he said, filling the tank from a can with a cigarette on the go. It's a possibility. White moves across to the wrecked car, circles around. As Bram and I follow, I can see there's a more intense area of burning on the ground towards the back of a car, a trail of ash where the fire had spread to the hedgerow. There are definite signs of pooling of an accelerant here, the fire officer says, and that, he indicates a ragged metal shape lying where the scorching is worst, might once have been a petrol can. But if you'd been that foolish, you wouldn't get back in the car, would you? You'd try and run, surely. Suicide, then? Listening to their discussion, I can't help feeling it's more upsetting than the sight of the body. They seem so dispassionate, so matter-of-fact. It's almost as if they've forgotten they're talking about a real person, someone who's lost their life in a hideous way. The policeman, standing over the shrouded bundle, casts a sideways look at me, rolls his eyes. We're probably thinking the same thing. The obvious answers staring them in the face. Who'd commit suicide like that? I blurt out. It's murder. It's got to be. A shudder engulfs me. I just hope the poor bugger was dead before the fire started.
Thank you for that. Well, that certainly sets a scene. And I hope that's intrigued everybody. Pardon me. Then.
Made everyone feel poorly, sorry.
Now, as evident from what you said and from the reading, this is set at around the time of D-Day.
Yep.
Your three novels are set in the home front of the
Yes.
Second World War.
Yep.
So you go from 1941 to 1943 to 1944.
Yep.
And the war is more than, in some ways, more than just a backdrop. It does provide plot drivers in the novels themselves. And so given that this one now is set around D-Day,
Yep.
and the war in Europe obviously still has a ways to go, and of course the war in the Pacific's not till another year
Yeah.
or so. So if there's going to be a fourth Joe Fox novel,
Yeah.
is it still going to be the war, or is it?
It's started, the fourth one. I have made a start on it. It's called, at the moment it's called Victory Harvest, and it is set in September 1945.
Okay.
So actually right at the very end of the war. The Treaty of Surrender for the Japanese was signed on the 2nd of September, but in Britain we had celebrated the surrender of the Japanese on the 15th of August, so it's actually set right at the beginning of September. So yeah, I have moved a little bit past the end of the war,
Okay.
but the war is still having a huge impact on people's lives at that point.
As it did in this country into the 1950s.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So you still get, you still have some mileage out of it.
I had a ration card as a baby, so I've still got it. So
There's books are also set against a very familiar landscape, well, familiar to yourself and familiar to a lot of the people here. We sort of know the area, and but it's set 80 years now in the past. And while there's probably lots in Romsey and Winchester and that haven't changed in those 80 years, there's certainly other things that have. I mean, there's been quite a bit of development outside of the city centers, great housing tracts going on, industrial estates, motorways, roads, all of that's much changed the landscape and the social and cultural sense of the area here. And there's also been other social and cultural change outside of that, especially with things like women's lives and things like that. So I would expect that it's a difficult and tricky thing to strip away all of that to try to avoid anachronisms cropping up and such like that. So is there a practice to that? Is there?
I guess there is. Yeah, the first book, obviously, because I was writing it as part of a PhD, I had, in a way, the luxury of time, and I had the luxury of being able to do lots of research. And I did do a lot of research to make sure that I was setting it as it should, in Romsey. It was mostly in Romsey, and that having been brought up in Romsey in the 50s, I could remember a lot that hadn't changed. I talked to my mum-in-law, who was still alive then, who remembered Romsey in the 30s and 40s during the war, and she was able to tell me some of the things that hadn't changed. And it was a small town when I was a little girl, and things hadn't changed very much. The infrastructure hadn't changed. The building hadn't happened to make it a bigger town. The same, I guess, for Winchester, although I wasn't so familiar with Winchester at that point in my life. So I had chosen a period of time. I'd chosen to set it in the war because I was very interested in both wartime history and local history at that period. And I'd chosen then, and I'd also drawn on my own childhood memories of how things had been when I was very little, and how people had been, and the sort of insularity of the community that the town that I describe actually was at that point. Obviously, a very white, very class-ridden, I would say, community when I was a little girl, and I have used those memories to put some of the social structures, especially into the first one, which has got a lot about Jo actually comes back to Romsey having been away for a long time. She's illegitimate. She's considered to be a bit below par. Her social structure, she comes from a working class family, and she is up against the sort of social structures that those sort of people don't have anything much to say for themselves. And in a way, that's probably the most anachronistic thing that I do in the books, in that you have a female protagonist set in the past, and you have to give her a bit more agency than maybe she would have had actually. Accepting the wartime gave me a excuse to give her more agency because the men were mostly away, and so she was able to do things that she might not have been able to do either pre-war or post-war. So I kind of use that, but it is a kind of convention, I guess, that if you're writing a woman back in that time, you are going to have to give her a bit more agency if you're going to give her anything to do and any adventures to have, and to achieve anything very much, unless she comes from a particular class. And I had chosen to put her into a kind of a lower class situation, if you want to call it that, because I wanted to do it so she had lots of conflict in her life. One of those things they teach you about at creative writing, you need conflict in your story.
Well, it can't be all be sunny days,
That's right.
there's it's always interesting reading about some place that you're familiar with too, and so it's a tricky. I think something, I suppose, you don't necessarily have to think about the book going outside of the area, but you have to think your local readership is going to be an eagle eye out, saying, "Ooh,
Yes.
can't get there from here," kind of thing.
Yes.
You know,
and that was one of the things that, I mean, I use local maps. There's a really wonderful site, the National National Library of Scotland, that does old maps, or old. When I say old, I'm talking 20th century maps, and that's really good. And I studied them a lot, and where you could go, and I tried to remember where you could go. I have to say, it was my supervisor for my director of studies for my thesis, my PhD, who said, "Don't pretend it's somewhere else. Call it Romsey. Make it Romsey. Let people know it was Romsey," which I was quite worried about, but he was absolutely right. But what I had to do, and what I chose to do, and what I've chosen to do all the way through, is that the places are right and the geography is as right as I can make it. I have actually made a couple of little errors, which I can tell you if you really want to know. But I know there are a couple of little errors which nobody so far has told me about, which is quite good. But I try and make the geography right. Obviously the characters are fictional, the events are fictional, in the sense that I don't think there was ever a murder in Romsey in any of the years that I say so. I'm sure there have been some, but not those years, and not in those ways. But I try and make sure that everywhere else you could walk around Romsey and you could go to the places I say you could, in the way that I say you could go there, unless somebody's pulled down a house, or put up a barrier, or put a road through somewhere. But I have chosen to, when I put a protagonist or a villain in a house, I change the name of the house, even though the house is still there. And on Saturday I was in Romsey doing a sign-in, and somebody came up to me and said, "I want to ask you a question." And I said, "Yes." They said, "Is Bram's house such and such a house?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "And I've forgotten something else, is that somewhere else?" And I said, "Yes." I thought so. So I got it right, and they were able to do it. But I mean, otherwise, yes, I try and make sure that the places are right, even if everything else is not so right.
It's Kate Atkinson, and her last Jason brought the title just flown out of my head, but the one that's set in the Northeast.
Yes.
At the end of it, she has a little afterwards where she's basically telling people not to write into her, that she's aware that you can't get from this point to that point in the time she has the characters doing it. She said it was necessary for the plot that they got there in that time, even though it was much, in reality, much further away. She says, "Don't bother writing me."
Well, in the second book, I really set myself a puzzle, because I'd decided I wanted to use Hursley House, where they had Supermarine were during the latter part of the war, with their design office and things. And because I'd got my main character in Romsey, and then I got Hursley, and then I'd also set some of it in Winchester, and how on earth were they going to get there? Petrol rationing, no cars, so there were a lot of bike rides, and I had to think, how long is it going to take? I don't ride a bike, I can't ride a bike, I fall off bikes, so I had to Google, and it says how long it takes to get from one place to another. But it was really frustrating, because nothing could happen quickly. I had to.
Well, that's it. I mean, this
third one's back in Romsey. It makes it a lot easier.
You do have, without going into any of the plot thing, you do have your character going back and forth to Southampton quite a bit.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, boy, it's a bit of a it's a bit of a trip now, but then that's because of traffic.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't.
The traffic, obviously, the bikes, and there weren't so many cars, so that made it a bit easier.
I know these are crime novels, and you said earlier that you started with your thesis about doing comparison with Golden Age of crime and such like that. But it's just interesting about the sort of things that are required working in the genre, and crime novels are the sort of epitome of plot-driven novels. You can't get much more plot-driven than. And
I'm rubbish at plots.
Well, there's you're anticipating my question. I didn't think you're rubbish at it. I was just wondering, how you go about constructing the plots, and whether you had a system for doing that, and whether you know how you planned, if there is a plan.
I would start out with characters. So Bram and Joe had been around in my head for a long time, waiting for a story in a way. So before I actually went off to do my BA, I had Joe and Bram in my head, and I'd got a little beginning of a story, which actually was set in 1947 rather than in wartime. And then they had to sit on the shelf for 3 years until I got around to doing the PhD. But I had the characters first and what they were doing. And I love Golden Age crime. I absolutely adore it. And I've read, you know, I reread it too, which people say to me, how can you reread it? You know, who done it? And I said, it doesn't matter who done it, it's what happens. Not so much Agatha Christie, but Sayers and Allingham and, you know, those Golden Age crime stories that have got lots of character. And my stories are pretty much character driven. So the first one, there was a sort of double plot with it, with Joe on a personal quest as well as the quest to find out what happened to the victim of the crime. And they kind of twine together really easily. And actually I didn't, in a way, I better not tell you if you haven't read it yet. And if you have read it yet, sorry, but there isn't a huge amount of plot in it. You know, the plot is more about people and how people work. And the second one, I really wanted to get in the business about the Spitfire being, you know, the offices being in Hursley Park, and that kind of sat in the middle. And I read there's a book which is available online. I don't know whether you can actually get it, called Murden, and it's the history of Hursley Park House. And there's lots of stories about what happened during the war when Supermarine were at Hursley Park House. And I kind of used those stories, and there was sort of a suggestion that there had been a suggestion that there might have been some sabotage, and there might have been some spying, espionage happening from there. So I don't know that there actually was, but I used that as a kind of driver for it. And then this last one, I can't remember how I got the plot for that. I'm working on the new one, and I've got kind of that plot in my head, and I've sort of forgotten how I did that one. I think it was partly because I wanted the D-Day to be in it, and partly because I had to get rid of somebody, and the story was.
We can't go into that. But
getting rid of somebody.
There's yes, obviously can't talk about that
No,
too much.
not too much.
But no, it's just one of those things that pardon me, that obviously you can put a lot more into a crime novel than the plot, but without the plot, it's not a crime.
Yeah, you do need a plot. It's always the bit I have the hardest trouble with, writing the plot and trying to work out how I'm going to make everything fit together. And actually in Treachery, I got myself up a dark alley with it because I'd put something in a place where there was nothing, and then I had to work out a way to make it actually work. So.
Well, it's interesting reading that because I know Hursley fairly well from I on the softball team. We used to play at Hursley, so I know the grounds pretty well. I've been in the house as well, but of course there's the IBM campus there, so they built quite a lot around there, and I'm sure it's much changed from.
It is, but fortunately that book that I was telling you about.
The village hasn't.
Has got lots and lots of plans of the house and the grounds and lots of information. And actually Hursley Park was easy to research comparatively to the latest one with Broadlands in it. Broadlands is kind of really a closed book. It's really hard to get to. I put out a plea on a local history site on Facebook, and to get somebody to be able to tell me a bit about Broadlands during the war, because I knew it had been an annex for the Royal Southampton Hospital, because during D-Day, around D-Day, Royal Southampton was the receiving hospital for casualties, and they emptied it out and they sent all their patients up to Broadlands and various other places around, so that they were empty, so that the casualties from D-Day could come into that hospital. And I tried to find out about it, and could I find out about it? And I did this thing on Facebook and said, doing some research for a novel. and can anyone tell me anything about Broadlands during the war? And somebody really sweetly put, oh, are you the one that wrote the treachery at Hursley Park House, I think? And I said, yeah, that's me. And I then got squashed and sent off Facebook on that site because it looked like I was touting for business, and I wasn't at all. So I never got my information. Eventually, I made it up.
There's, it's interesting too, because this one here, there's a lot of what goes on involves the hospital and nursing and things like that. So I would expect you obviously drew upon.
I did.
Your
and
past
actually,
on that.
I very seldom use a character, a real character that I knew. But there's a nurse in that book who is based very strongly on a nurse I knew back in the day when I was nursing at Winchester.
It's the Irish one.
Yeah, St Paul's Hospital was still a hospital, and I did a stint there, and I worked with an Irish nurse who had been here in the war, nursing in the war, and she was lovely. And there is a sort of, she's in the book anyway. I mean, it's not her, but it's a tribute to her that she's there.
I mean, obviously you can draw on your your experience as nursing, but again, nursing in those days was different.
Oh, very different.
Than,
yeah, absolutely.
The sister.
Yeah.
What sister was, ruled with iron, something.
I was one of those.
Well, it's all starch and all with the the various headgear and what's all the.
The day I won my, I passed my SRN finals and I got my silver buckle and my frilly hat was the day, and that was a day.
Well, it's all very different.
It is very different now. Yeah.
Still hard.
Still hard, yeah.
Well, you're talking about your character Joe's background, all the rest of that. Sort of anticipated my last question, so I won't ask that since.
Oh right, okay.
Well, I was going to ask how you'd come up with the character, but you've sort of covered that by saying what you needed her to represent.
Yeah.
So I think that since that would have been my last question, if anybody's got questions in the audience, we can take now.
Do you feel upset when the people who ask you to edit take out something that means a lot to you, and then maybe do you like what you have to put in?
Funnily enough, but it's a question I've been asked a lot of times before. No, it's fine. It's a perfectly good question, and it's something I've had to think about. The first book, the one that won the prize, and I went off in a great, hey, I've won the prize, so it must be perfect. And I was really, I suppose, dumbstruck again to discover it needed a lot of work doing to it still. And for the most part, you have to say what I wrote for a thesis was done for a particular purpose, for an audience, for an academic audience. And what they were asking for was a commercial book, one that would sell. And you have to say they're the experts, they know what they want to do. And they were very nice about it. I mean, I had to do a lot of editing, but they were very nice about it. And there was just one passage that they wanted to get rid of, and there's a thing in creative writing, they say, murder your darlings. If you really, really like a piece of writing, it's a good chance that that's the bit you ought to throw out and start again. And there was one piece that I just desperately didn't want to get rid of, and I bargained in the end. And I said, look, I'll get rid of all the rest, but I want to keep this piece, please. And they eventually said, well, of course you can keep it. And I think I was justified, because when I was talking about that book quite some time ago, somebody came up to me and said, the bit I really loved that bit there. And I thought, hey, yes, that was all right. but funnily enough, the subsequent two books, Treachery and Conflict, I think I've got better because they didn't ask me to edit content pretty much. They were in Conflict, they asked me to put in a scene, which I was quite happy to do, but I haven't had to do that sort of extensive editing. They've got house style, and they go through it and they find that despite how many times you've read it, you've left a glitch in, or you've spelled something wrong, or you've said something happened then and then you say it's happened then, and you get it right, and they're really helpful from that point of view. But generally speaking, there's two subsequent books I haven't had to edit so much, but they are the experts, and if they know what will sell, then it's like the titles, you know, they know what will sell. So you go with it, you know, you've got to be pragmatic about it, and you know, that's all really. So yeah, I didn't mind too much. There were a couple of times I was, that's my favourite bit.
Yeah,
I don't want to get
You
rid
just
of it.
have to learn how to sneak in the existential angst.
Yeah, and as I say, in the end, the bit I really, really didn't want to get rid of, they let me keep, and it was okay.
Good.
It worked.
Is there anybody else with a question?
This is a bit of an odd one, really. But when you're a mature writer,
Yes.
and you're asked for your biography, and actually your career has been all sorts of things
Yes.
except writing.
Yes.
How did you go about, doing that bio?
Do you know, I was really lucky, Linda, because I think if I had been when I sent the first book off to the Richard and Judy competition, I had to write a little bio, and I wrote a little bio which is very much like the one that you see inside the book, you know, which just said, you know, I've done this and I've done that and I've done the other, and you know, I've been married 40 years, which I thought would give them a clue that I wasn't 5, if that makes any sense. But I think if I had been sending it off to an agent or an editor cold, I think my age might have told against me, because I think their editors and agents aren't looking for a single book, they're looking for a career. And I think they'd have said, "Ooh, she's knocking on a bit, I'm not sure whether we'll have that one." And I think I was really lucky that it won the prize, and then they didn't have to worry about me being an old lady. And actually, I mean, the hardest thing of all is that all the people that I work with, you know, the agents and the editors, are so young. When I was writing Treachery at Hursley Park House, when I submitted that to her, the editor that I submitted it to, she was a new editor to me, so I didn't know her from before, and she said I had to put in, because I'd put, you know, when Supermarine were at Hursley Park House, and she said, well, you have to explain about Spitfires, and I had to explain what a Spitfire, you know, what Supermarine did and what a Spitfire was and all the rest of it. And I kind of was like, surely the people who are going to be reading a Second World War fiction are going to know what a Spitfire was. But she's so young.
You can't make any assumptions.
And there was something in this one as well, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was something where she said, you must clarify what this means, because people might not understand what this was. And then you realise how ever so young they are.
As an example, I use a lot was trying to explain to a younger person about noir, so Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett and James Caan and that sort of thing. And I said, well, think like a Humphrey Bogart movie.
Who?
And I thought, well, where do you go from that? I mean, I gave up. I said, you know, it's.
I know.
So you can't make any assumptions about any sort of common cultural
you can't.
heritage and knowledge being passed along, which again, sort of the opposite thing from the anachronisms is then
it's
having to have somehow explain things that you would, you know.
It's explaining it so you hope that it won't make people who know about it think, well, of course everybody knows that. I have to say they were really helpful. The archivist at Hursley was really helpful. The idea that I had to put the park in, because most people call it Hursley House, but they wanted the park in because they wanted a kind of a nudge to the glamour, or the, you know, the Downton Abbey or something. So that's why it's Hursley Park House rather than just Hursley House.
Is there anybody else have a question?
Can you tell us about your covers? How does that work?
Well, I'm lucky with the covers. I didn't have any input in it, Claire. I mean, they sent me a picture and said, do you like it? And I said, yes, thank you very much. The first one, if I'm picky, there are about 5 different mistakes in the picture, which is, somebody pointed out these are the wrong kind of aircraft. And anyway, the aircraft that drops the bomb that starts the whole story off, there's only one of them. There's ambulance outside the ruined pub, and the pub doesn't look like that. and she wasn't standing there then because she wasn't even there at that point. But it's a nice cover, and they were lovely, and they gave me the gilt, the gilt edging and the proper wartime typeface and all the rest of it. And then it just went from there. So the second one had the same edging, the little leaves on the edging, and I think they did actually quite a good job on the house picture, I think, although again the plane's maybe not quite right, and they did it so that it matched with this one, and I went from gold to silver, and I thought, well, the next one will be bronze then, won't it? But they did go back to gold for this one. And this one, instead of going with the blues, they went to the red, and I'm really fond of this cover. I mean, there are also, if you want, geographical errors in that one, because you can't stand there and see.
Is that the Abbey?
It is Romsey Abbey, but if you were standing there where I've put the car, you couldn't see Romsey Abbey from it. But it's neither here nor there. If it makes people pick the book up, that's all that matters.
They look lovely together.
They do. I've been really lucky because they are a nice.
That's good, because especially younger readers like the way they look on the shelf. Like you have to get like a TikTok thing going, and that's. That'll make your fortune.
I did say in the very beginning, I just hope they don't put a dopey girl standing on the front, and they did put a girl on the front. Fortunately, they put her looking the other way, so she doesn't look too dopey.
I didn't notice the girl.
Oh right,
Yeah,
So no, I can see on the red one.
there's a girl
Wearing a
here.
hat.
No, the red one.
Red one, she's wearing a hat.
Yeah,
isn't
she's
she?
wearing a hat. Well, she's wearing the same sort of hat, so she's in
Okay.
blue there, and she's there a little bit more
Oh, she's got a
full
silvery
face,
jumper.
but she's got a red hat there, and here she's all in red. So
Not
I
to,
read that book and I can't remember seeing the woman on it.
well,
There you are.
not to give away too much about this one, but she's undercover in this one.
Yes.
She's
Yeah.
dyed her hair, and
she has. Yeah.
well, not a phony mustache or something.
Used to say red hat, no knickers.
Right.
Sorry. Do you remember that?
No, she wears her knickers.
She wear a
she's
red
fine.
hat, she
Well,
hasn't got any knickers
most
on.
of the time, anyway.
So
All
normal.
right. Well, now I know.
Most of the time.
It's a bit late for this knowledge for me, but now I know. Any further questions? Because if we don't, I think we're going to stop at this moment, and there's going to be something special.
Ooh.
There's a nod to somebody. Wink. So, my colleagues. What could it be?
I can't go
It could be someone from the.
She's looking slightly scared.
As Claire
that
did
doesn't-
mention,
Oh.
it is a birthday. Obviously, no candles in a bookshop, but
Oh wow.
there is a cake.
Oh.
Oh look.
I don't know how high up.
And it's got the covers on.
They work
All
quite well
three
together.
covers. Oh, that's lovely.
You can do that.
And,
How lovely. Thank you so much.
That can be shared. We do have
Good knife.
a knife. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. How lovely. I know.
Would you like me to take a picture?
I
of
would, yes, please. Oh, gosh, if I don't drop.
Share it with us.
Yes, please.
It's on a plate as well. It is on a plate.
Why don't you take the cake home?
No, we'll
Don't
cut
spoil
it.
it
No,
now.
we'll have it.
Well, we could remove the.
No,
I
no,
love
we'll.
those
I think we should share it. Absolutely. Cake is sharing.
Let me take a really good close up.
Yes, I'm going to cut it. Cake's for sharing.
Right. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Claire for a very entertaining evening, very informative evening. And to wish you a happy birthday.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and Bob, thank you, and it's been lovely.
Cheers.
It's always nice to talk about my book.
Yourself?
I was going to say myself, but you know, slightly.
Oh, sorry.
It's been pouring. Sorry.
That's okay.
Shall I hand it to you before I drop it? But yeah, we'll
Right. Well, thank you. That's
Thank
good,
you.
good all. And the books are for sale. And Claire will be happy, I'm sure, to sign some for a little bit. Is that? Yeah.
Oh yeah, you've got to have a bit of cake. Please don't go without a piece of cake.
That was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.